it's an expression that they used to use back in the 90s, in the Clinton days, Bill Clinton days. And that is when they're talking about working class people or labor unions or black voters. And that is this phrase that they would use: they have nowhere else to go.
Right.
They've got nowhere else to go. And they said this about when they said this on numerous occasions, right? It would crop up in the reporting. And that's what Trump did. He gave the white working class voters somewhere else to go. And that's the whole trick of what he did.
And let me ask you another question too about, because what's happening right now with Trump in the media, and you're a person in the news media, is that Trump on a daily basis insults somebody in the press, and then the press and all the neoliberals and the corporate Democrats go crazy rallying around that press person, no matter how disingenuous or what is, like Jim Acosta. Jim Acosta is a grandstanding knucklehead who hasn't asked a good question in his entire career. And now everybody's supposed to rally around CNN because of Trump. Now,
can I tell you an anecdote?
Sure.
So I gave a talk a while ago, and it was on C-SPAN. In the talk, I made fun of Rush Limbaugh. I mean, gentle humor, right? And I compared Rush's radio show to being in North Korea, and you know how every house has a speaker. It's not a radio. You can't tune it. It only gets one station. It's just wired into, and it's Kim Jong-un all the time, right? And so I compared Rush Limbaugh to that, which really is the case if you're ever in like Topeka, Kansas or somewhere like that, where everywhere you go, he's on, right?
Well,
you walk into one building. Anyhow, so I made fun of him a little bit, right? And he didn't like that, and he went after me on his radio show, and he said it's not me that's like North Korea. He said it's CNN in airports. Think about that for a second. When you go to the airport, you can't change the channel, and he's right. It's always CNN for whatever reason, and that is true. The airport it is kind of a North Korean. It's a propaganda environment. We were talking before the show started about propaganda museums, and the airports are also propaganda places for a different kind of propaganda, more corporate propaganda. But CNN is always on in those places, and you aren't allowed to change the channel. And so a lot of people, when they look at CNN's war with Trump or vice versa, Trump's war with CNN, you and we follow politics, and we understand that the president of the United States is a very powerful man, right? But a lot of people are like, well, he's not on the TV all the time when I go to the airport. That's CNN that has that power. That's not Donald Trump that has that power. That's CNN. And so they look at that and they think he really is standing up to power. And in some ways, it's like, here in Washington, we know that obviously the president is more powerful than CNN. But there's this illusion that other people have. And it's exactly as you described it. So a lot of people look at that and they're cheering for him.
Yes. Yeah. And that's the thing that people can't understand is that, like, in this CNN Donald Trump battle, or this circus is what it actually is. Because if they really cared about journalism, he's attacking journalism. If they really cared, they would say something about Julian Assange. They say nothing about Julian Assange. And President Barack Obama used the Espionage Act to prosecute whistleblowers and journalists more than all the presidents combined. So that's how you know what Jim Acosta and CNN is doing is a circus, because they don't really give a shit about the freedom of the press. Because if they did, they would say something. What they care about is ratings, and that's what's happening. And the thing that people can't get through their head, Thomas, is the same thing they can't get through their head in the Robert Mueller investigation, is that maybe there's no good guys. Maybe CNN is full of shit, and so is Trump. And maybe Robert Mueller is a guy who lied us into the Iraq war and is also full of shit, and so is Trump. And the right wing will high five each other and get excited when Trump flips off CNN, because they've spent 2 years pushing a conspiracy theory with no basis in evidence, so they know they're full of it.
Which conspiracy theory?
The Russiagate conspiracy theory.
Oh, okay. So that's, by the way, that's a really interesting story, and but you've raised like 5 really good topics here. It's a point that I make all the time. This is a country of 300 million people. Okay, we have 3 newspapers that matter in this country of 300 million people. Okay, that, my friend, is fucked up. Okay, you know that TV news takes their leads from the printed press, from the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal. And the Wall Street Journal is something of an outlier. I used to work there, and they, thanks to their paywall and stuff like that, they've succeeded in this is my opinion, but they're something of an outlier. So that leaves you with two: New York Times and the Washington Post. They're almost exactly the same. They'll run the same picture on page one, They have like their headline. They always cover the same stories in exactly the same way. Their opinion sections have exactly the same opinions. This is for a country of 300 million people. I was in France recently, where forget France. I was in Kansas City the other day. Kansas City Star. The A section of the Kansas City Star is 8 pages long. These people can't even cover they have trouble covering. I don't want to, they try hard, right? I like them a lot, but they have trouble covering what's happening in Topeka, let alone what's happening in Washington, D.C. It's all wire service copy, and this is every local newspaper in America. Look at your LA Times out there. Look at the mighty Chicago Tribune, which was once, in the 40s and 50s was one of the most important papers in the world. And it's a shadow. It's nothing. And this is happening everywhere you go in this country. The voices are down to just this tiny, tiny handful of people, and they all agree with each other. That's not a healthy situation.
Well, tell me what the consequence of that is.
The consequence is that we increasingly – so there's an essay in – hold up the book again, Rendezvous with Oblivion. There's an essay in there about the way the Washington Post treated Bernie Sanders. What we know about the world is dictated to us by a very small handful of people who all agree, they have all the same preconceptions, all the same way of viewing the world. And it's not that they're liberal. Okay, they hated Bernie Sanders. The whole liberal media bias thing is a red herring. It's not that they're liberal. It's that they all come from the same class background. Do you remember, Jimmy? I'm older than you, but when I was younger and lived in Chicago, we had a columnist called Mike Royko.
Yeah, I loved Mike Royko.
Yeah. And he came from a blue collar background. And in fact, the column was written for blue collar readers.
That's why I liked it.
Idea. And there used to be hundreds of columnists like Mike Royko all over this country.
Jimmy Breslin.
That was a genre. They were all over the place. And there are, how many of those guys are left? That's right. Zero? That I know of. Maybe it's some local paper somewhere there's still, but there's nothing like that in there's no voice like that in the national news. It's all everybody comes from the same social background, the same position. They look at things the same.